Good day, folks, or at least I hope good day. My name is Matthew Browngan. Thanks for coming to Finding the Warmth for Our Sun here at Madison 365. You can find us every Wednesday on Spotify, Stitcher, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube. Please hit subscribe so you can catch us every week, or I guess me. One of these days I'll have some guests and break the monotony of just me talking, lecturing, speaking, however you want to think about it. So I hope you're doing well. Hope your health is doing well, and as well as can be. So today, though, I'm going to be talking a bit about the United States and how it meets most of the definition of a failed state. And this would be the second time in our history that we'd be a failed state. Effectively, the lead up to and the Civil War was the United States, well, being a failed state. So this isn't anything new in a historical context, right? But still a big deal. The United States is effectively a group of regional governments right now with varying effectiveness. You can think of them as our states, right, and cities, with the federal government effectively failing in a lot of real sense. And much of the GOP has no wish to actually govern, but instead they go out of their way to break government and then justify that as their take for smaller government, continuing a vicious cycle, while growing other parts of the government, such as deepening the reach of the Department of Homeland Security and security state, while other services and key things that create a functional government are cut or further neglected. Now, that's not to say that Democrats don't have any responsibility in this, as they very much do, but they at least are not intentionally breaking the functions of government. They are just meeting various different levels of effectiveness in governance. Some individuals or some groups being more effective than others. There are, we can take a look at the Obama administration, particularly in its failure to fully reinvest in U.S. infrastructure, address income inequality. Well, it tepidly addressed healthcare in the United States, while perpetually investing again in the security state. Other states, or I should say other regional governments, are depending, can be doing a bit better than others, but still find themselves short resource to effectively address the issues that they're facing, particularly with infrastructure and income inequality and poverty. All right. So what is a failed state? And I think this will help in this conversation in reading a definition. So a failed state, within the idea of the sovereign nation state in the modern world system, means it cannot project authority over its territory and peoples, and it cannot protect its national boundaries. The governing capacity of a failed state is such that it is unable to fulfill the administrative and organizational tasks required to control people and resources, and can provide only minimal public services. Its citizens no longer believe their government is legitimate, and the state becomes illegitimate in the eyes of the international community. A failed state is composed of feeble and flawed institutions. Often the executive barely functions, while the legislature, judiciary, bureaucracy, and armed forces have lost their capacity and professional independence. A failed state suffers from crumbling infrastructure, faltering utility supplies, and educational and health facilities, and deteriorating basic human development indicators such as infant mortality and literacy rates. Failed states create an environment of flourishing corruption and negative growth rates where honest economic activity cannot flourish. I think in just hearing that, a lot of that, sounds familiar. It is unclear exactly how our armed forces are maintaining the capacity and professional independence right now. That is up in the air, definitely. I think our executive branch barely functions. And a lot of those we do meet, a lot of the other things we meet, well, the threshold for. Right now, the international community does not trust the United States. Effectively, we are a rogue state. Our democracy is hanging on by a thread. Well, never fully developed, as there's always been those disenfranchised within our country. There is massive amounts of, well, growing, I should say, amounts of election fraud or attempted election fraud, where Trump, particularly right now, is doing all he can to sow chaos in our election, with massive efforts, particularly by the GOP, to disenfranchise as many people as possible and suppress the vote. Wisconsin's a great example of this, where the majority of people in this state voted for Democrats. We are a minority rule state within our legislature. The U.S. Senate is a quasi-democratic institution and is also a minority rule institution, where again more Democrats voted, or more people voted for Democrats, I should say, nationally than there are Democrats elected to the Senate. Our president was not elected by popular vote. We are a minority rule nation right now, increasingly so in a lot of ways. So that's kind of on one note. What are some other ways that the United States is meeting this? Well, there's minimal trust of our governing institutions. In August 2020, Gallup poll gave Congress an 80% disapproval rating. Congress typically has a high disapproval rating. This is particularly high historically. President Trump has a 53% disapproval rating. Historically, the president is typically approved at a higher percentage than Congress, but this is still a pretty high number of disapproval for a president. We have stagnated wages, where the minimum wage can afford rent in exactly 0 states. The U.S. federal government is particularly doing nothing about it. It is left up to states to raise the minimum wage. There are more people unemployed than there are jobs, again, with the federal government not doing anything about it. Income inequality and wealth inequality is growing. Where production has increased, wages have stagnated over the last 30 plus years. Since COVID, billionaires have gained about $1 trillion in wealth, while most everybody else is going broke. We have failed in our COVID response, with Brazil being one of the only other countries doing worse than the United States, with over 200,000 dead in the United States, right? This is a massive, massive failure. 210,000 people dead. Our death rates are some of the worst in the world. This is massive. Recently, the 50 richest Americans are worth as much as the poorest 165 million. Most people can't afford a $400 life crisis. Are working poor or working broke, where you're living paycheck to paycheck, even if you can afford a middle class life. And you're probably in debt. Most people are living in debt. Healthcare drives many in debt, even if you have health insurance. There's disproportionate enforcement of the law, where president believes law and order means he and his supporters can do whatever they want, but it is the opponents who break the law, even if they're not breaking the law, are somehow illegal. The GOP in general does this, and will also disproportionately enforce the law in such a way, such as the Missouri governor just said they pardon that white couple that pointed guns and are being charged, I'm forgetting with exactly what, but with aiming guns at protesters. Said he would pardon them if they were convicted. Where one party and effectively a two-party system encourages lawlessness within white supremacist militias, basically terrorist organizations, to take up arms, have encouraged in a lot of ways them taking action against other governmental entities, as we see in Michigan, where they criminalize protesters, arguing that Black Lives Matter protests are always riots and illegal. Well, I should say it's recently studied, and 93% of Black Lives Matter protests since the George Floyd killings have been peaceful protests. And we are ignoring where large chunks of the police response to these protests have been violent. But actually, let's step back a little bit on this study. So we know within this study, right? Let's see here. Yeah. The vast majority of demonstrations, events associated with Black Lives Matter movement are nonviolent. In more than 93% of all demonstrations connected to the movement, demonstrators have not engaged in violence or destructive activity. Peaceful protests are reported on over 2,400 distinct locations around the country. And they define violent demonstrations as, it's a little bit wide, but demonstrations themselves engage in violently disruptive or destructive acts of targeting other individuals or property, businesses, basically rioting, right? And despite the fact that demonstrations associated with the Black Lives Matter movement have been overwhelmingly peaceful, more than 90%, nearly 1 in 10, have been met with government intervention, compared to 3% of all other demonstrations. It's an interesting stat there, right? Okay. They continue on. Authorities have used force, such as firing less than lethal weapons like tear gas, rubber bullets, and pepper spray, and beating protesters with batons in over 54% of demonstrations in which they have engaged. Overall, 5% of all events linked with Black Lives Matter movement have been met with force by authorities, compared to under 1% of all other demonstrators. Very authoritarian. And also a demonstration of, well, failure by the state in a lot of real ways. Let's move on to infrastructure. The United States has persistent infrastructure issues that neither party has successfully or fully addressed, particularly on the macro level. Some Democratic governors are doing better than others, but on a whole, the United States has, well, basically failing infrastructure. According to civil engineers, they issued a 2017 infrastructure report card, and they do this every 4 years. So we're coming up soon here in 2021, right? They gave U.S. infrastructure a D+. Some highlights of this, according to Business Insider, but from their reports, they estimate that ASCE estimates the U.S. needs to spend some $4.5 trillion by 2025 to improve the state of the country's roads, bridges, dams, airports, schools, and more. Well, this was, again, 2017, so we're not doing well. They need $123 billion just to fix the bridges, with a D+ grading on bridges. Dams get a D, or some 15,500 high hazard dams in the U.S. Drinking water gets a D-. 1 million pipes have been in use for almost 100 years. We know this in Wisconsin, there's a large amount of lead pipes throughout the state. They're not the only ones. There's flints all over this country. They gave energy a D+, with the majority of transmission and distribution lines were built in the mid-20th century with a life expectancy of 50 years. Between 2016 and 2025, there's an investment gap about $177 billion. Hazardous waste, they gave a D+ grade. Inland waterways, D. Levees, D. Parks and recreation, D+. Ports, C+. Airports, D. Roads, D. Schools, D+. Solid waste, C-. Rails from weight and basically for rails, they gave it B, which is really the best, but that's off the weight of freight rail systems. They didn't really distinguish where passengers rail, but they said basically really passenger rails need a lot of investment. Overall, transit gets a D-, and wastewater gets a D+, with majority of wastewater investment last really being done with the Clean Water Act. This would have been under Nixon in the 1970s. And we are seeing, particularly with climate change, wastewater infrastructure being particularly stressed, very much in the Midwest, where massive investment needs to take place. And most of this investment is falling upon ratepayers, basically individuals, as the federal government and states aren't effectively investing in this. In 2017, also the UN did a report on extreme poverty in the U.S. Quick summary of it. It says you can find comparable living conditions of those in extreme poverty in the United States to those in third world countries. But when comparing overall rates of certain things like infant mortality, the United States has some of the highest, if not the worst, in what we might call the quote-unquote developed world. 2013, U.S. had the highest infant mortality rates in the developed world. Americans can expect to live shorter and sicker lives compared to people living in other rich democracies. U.S. inequality levels are far higher than those in most European countries. We have neglected tropical diseases, including Zika, and increasingly common in the United States, and it is estimated that 12 million Americans live with a neglected parasitic infection with hookworm, in places like Alabama. In terms of access to water and sanitation, the U.S. ranks 36th in the world. And these things are only getting worse. They have not been getting better. We've known these things getting worse for a little while now, right? Prison and police. With about 5% of the world's population, the U.S. has over 20% of the world's prison population. We have the largest prison population in the world, both in total numbers and per capita. We are a prison state. Increasingly, over the last 30, 40, 50 years, we've invested in incarceration and policing to address our social and civic ills, opposed to investing in things like water infrastructure, getting rid of lead pipes, which does increase, it seems like increases, rates of violence. One of the biggest decreases we saw, this is correlation, it's hard to know if it's causation, but was moving away from lead paint, right? That really seemed to have at least a correlation and possibly causation with decreasing of violence within the United States. We are investing less in housing, less and less on infrastructure, less and less on education, more and more on policing and prisons. We have effectively legalized a lot of forms of corruption. Didn't start with Citizens United, but Citizens United exponentially grew corruption in the United States. And now we are seeing flaunted, really open, illegal corruption. Trump is heading this up with openly flaunting the Hatch Act, which has minimal teeth. The IRS targets poor and middle income Americans, particularly black, across the United States far more than it does like faux billionaires like Trump or actual billionaires and wealthy individuals. We don't prosecute those at the heads of corporations when they commit crimes. We just charge the corporations pennies. We didn't prosecute banks and those that ran banks and have effectively let them get away with criminal behavior. There's been a major report out that just dropped on how many of our banks have laundered billions of dollars from criminal organizations, and they just received a slap on the wrist, just fines. Nobody was really prosecuted for these things. Yet if you or I were to do something, we would have the book thrown at us and see many years in jail. We have human rights abuses of our immigrant populations in committing genocide, and in U.S. citizens alike, both in committing genocide through COVID as well as through our police and carceral system. It was investigated. I mean, we see it all the time, both as well as just general human rights abuses by our police and by our prison systems, over and over and over again. With some departments, like the Chicago Police Department, committing practices of torture, such through Home and Square, it's an investigation of people disappeared, beat, and coerced into who knows what. a failure to respond to global warming at the level needed by Democrats, with the GOP not just failing to respond to global warming, but investing in measures that make it worse, that deepen it. And we are seeing an increase inability because of this to respond to things like forest fires, increasing rates of hurricanes, with infrastructure not being rebuilt. And now, and then now we have these criminal armed gangs or terrorists, these militias. This is a lot going on. And there are paths forward, but it's going to take a massive amount of investment. And not just investment, but a massive amount of actions of needing to put teeth on enforcement, decreasing aspects of corruption within the executive, disbanding ICE and the Department of Homeland Security, and prosecuting those for human rights violations and war crimes, prosecuting Donald Trump for human rights violations and war crimes. And to be real, we also, and it's hard to say because Biden took part in this, and we need to take a look at even prosecuting people like President Obama for war crimes, with his behaviors on immigration enforcement and expansion of the drone war internationally. Those are, by definition, war crimes that he took part in, and human rights violations that he took part in. We have to fully reckon with our histories of violence and legalized corruption. We need to start prosecuting wealthy individuals, heads of corporations that break the law, that intentionally break the law, that intentionally take part in corruption, take money out of politics and make massive investment in infrastructure with the Green New Deal, jobs guarantees, healthcare, not just reform, but reorganizing everything. Biden will have to pass some of the most sweeping economic stimulus packages, economic reforms, political reforms, banking reforms, corruption reforms, on top of rooting out corruption in the federal government, state governments, of enforcement of this corruption, investment in the IRS, of those taking part in massive fraud. I don't know if he's up to the task. So I think I'll end there before I go into too many other thoughts. So I'm Matthew Brown. Thank you for coming to Finding the Warmth for Our Sun. I am your host here at Madison 365. Find us every Wednesday on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, and YouTube. Hit subscribe so you don't miss us as we get into all other uplifting topics. Thank you. Have a good week. Stay safe. Wear a mask. Do that. And socially distance. Thank you. Have a good day.
This is 365 Media.